The crystal chandeliers of the Valdris royal palace cast dancing shadows across the opulent ballroom, where the cream of European society had gathered for Prince Alexander's 29th birthday celebration. The air hummed with conversations conducted in multiple languages, the rustle of silk and satin, and the melodic strains of a full orchestra that provided the perfect backdrop for an evening designed to demonstrate the absolute pinnacle of aristocratic privilege. At the far edge of the ballroom, near the servants' entrance where shadows offered some protection from curious gazes, Sophia Hartwell stood like a beautiful ghost, haunting the periphery of a world she had once known intimately. Her modest grey silk gown, borrowed from her employer's daughter, was elegant but clearly not of the same caliber as the elaborate creations surrounding her. The simple woolen shawl draped over her shoulders served both to ward off the evening chill and to obscure the signs of her reduced circumstances. "Look there," whispered Countess Margareta von Hausen to her companion, gesturing discreetly toward Sophia's solitary figure. "Do you see that young woman by the wall? She doesn't belong here, surely. Her dress, while pretty enough, is clearly not the work of any fashionable modiste." The observation sparked a ripple of interested attention among the nearby aristocrats, who had developed keen eyes for detecting social imposters attempting to infiltrate their exclusive gatherings. In a world where invitation lists were scrutinized with microscopic attention, and every face was either known or vouched for by someone of unquestionable standing, an unfamiliar presence immediately aroused suspicion. Sophia felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure against her skin, but she maintained her composure through years of training that had taught her to navigate hostile social waters. She had not sought invitation to this gathering. Indeed, she had actively avoided any situation that might expose her current circumstances to those who had once known her. But circumstances beyond her control had made her attendance necessary tonight. Lady Catherine Pembroke, her current employer, had fallen ill with fever just hours before the ball, leaving Sophia to deliver the urgent diplomatic correspondence that could not wait for morning. The sealed documents hidden within her reticule contained sensitive information about trade negotiations that required immediate attention from specific members of the diplomatic corps who would only be accessible during tonight's celebration. "Perhaps she's some diplomat's daughter," suggested Baron Wilhelm von Krause, with the dismissive tone reserved for those whose social position remained uncertain. "The smaller German states are always sending their provincial nobility to our court functions, hoping to secure advantageous marriages or trade agreements." The speculation continued to build around Sophia, like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. She recognized several faces from her previous life, people who had once bowed to her family's influence, but who now observed her with the calculating interest of predators sensing vulnerable prey. Prince Alexander Valdris himself had not yet noticed the growing whispers about the mysterious young woman, his attention consumed by the lavish praise being heaped upon him by a group of Italian dignitaries eager to secure favorable terms for their upcoming commercial negotiations. At 29, he had perfected the art of extracting maximum advantage from social situations, using his royal status and considerable charm to manipulate others into serving his interests. "Your Highness," gushed the Marchese di Montecroce, "surely this magnificent celebration surpasses even the legendary balls of Versailles. The sophistication, the elegance, the absolute perfection of every detail, it speaks to the refined sensibilities that make your court the envy of Europe." Prince Alexander's smile was sharp as a blade, reflecting his satisfaction with both the flattery and his ability to inspire it. He had orchestrated every aspect of the evening to demonstrate his power and influence, from the selection of guests to the arrangement of flowers, ensuring that everyone present understood their subordinate position in relation to his supreme authority. "You are too kind, Marchese," he replied with false modesty that fooled no one, "though I confess I take particular pleasure in hosting gatherings that bring together the finest representatives of European nobility. It provides such illuminating opportunities to observe character under the pressure of social performance." The comment carried undertones that made several listeners shift uncomfortably, recognizing the prince's reputation for using social occasions to humiliate those who displeased him or failed to show appropriate deference to his position. Sophia, unaware that she was gradually becoming the focus of predatory attention, completed her circuit of the ballroom's perimeter as she searched for Baron von Richter, the Prussian ambassador, whose signature was required on the diplomatic documents she carried. Her movement brought her closer to the main gathering of guests, where her presence could no longer be overlooked or dismissed as merely peripheral. "I say," announced Lord Pemberton with the voice of someone accustomed to being heard over considerable noise, "has anyone actually verified that young woman's invitation? She's been skulking about the edges of our gathering for quite some time without properly presenting herself to His Highness." The accusation struck the assembled company like a match touched to kindling, instantly transforming idle curiosity into active suspicion. The suggestion that someone might have gained unauthorized access to the prince's private celebration was tantamount to accusing them of criminal trespass and social fraud. Prince Alexander's attention snapped immediately to the source of the commotion, his predatory instincts aroused by the possibility of discovering an impostor in his midst. The prospect of publicly exposing and humiliating someone who had dared to deceive him held considerable appeal, promising the kind of entertainment that would be discussed in drawing rooms across Europe for months to come. "Indeed," he said with silky menace, his blue eyes fixing upon Sophia with the intensity of a hawk spotting wounded prey. "How remiss of me not to properly welcome all of my guests. Perhaps we should remedy that oversight immediately." The prince began moving through the crowd with deliberate purpose, his progress marked by the subtle parting of guests who sensed the approach of something dangerous and dramatic. Conversations ceased as he passed, replaced by the electric anticipation that preceded public spectacles of aristocratic judgment. Sophia, finally locating Baron von Richter near the diplomatic alcove, was in the process of approaching him when she became aware of the sudden hush that had fallen over the ballroom. The music continued, but the general conversation had died away, replaced by an ominous silence that spoke of focused attention directed towards some imminent drama. "Ah, there you are, my dear." Prince Alexander's voice carried clearly across the now silent ballroom as he approached Sophia with theatrical grace. "How delightful that you chose to attend our little gathering, though I confess myself puzzled, as I don't recall extending an invitation to someone of your particular circumstances." The words were chosen with surgical precision, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability about their cruel intent. The suggestion that Sophia's circumstances made her unworthy of invitation was clear to everyone present, though phrased with sufficient ambiguity to avoid direct accusations of gate-crashing. Sophia felt her blood freeze as she realized that her worst fears about attending this gathering were about to be realized. The diplomatic mission that had seemed so straightforward was transforming into a nightmare of public exposure and humiliation before the very people whose respect and discretion her current survival depended upon. "Your Highness," she said with careful dignity, "I am here on urgent diplomatic business that could not await a more convenient time. I carry communications that require immediate attention from diplomatic business." Prince Alexander's laugh was harsh and mocking, cutting through her explanation like a blade through silk. "How fascinating. And who, pray tell, would entrust diplomatic communications to someone whose very presence here suggests, shall we say, questionable credentials?" The assembled crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness the kind of social destruction that would provide gossip material for years to come. The prince's reputation for public humiliation was legendary, and his current mood suggested that tonight's victim would serve as an example to anyone else who might dare to presume beyond their proper station. "Perhaps," he continued with dangerous softness, "we should examine these supposed credentials more closely. After all, one cannot be too careful about the security of diplomatic communications in times such as these." Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the trap closing around her. To produce the documents would expose her current position as a mere secretary rather than the diplomatic representative she was impersonating. To refuse would confirm the prince's suggestions about her fraudulent presence. Either choice seemed destined to destroy the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for the past 2 years. "Your Highness," she tried once more, "I assure you that my mission here tonight is entirely legitimate." "Legitimate?" The prince's voice rose slightly, ensuring that every person in the ballroom could hear his next words clearly. "Then surely you won't object to removing that rather modest shawl so that we might all see exactly whom we're dealing with. After all, those with nothing to hide should welcome such transparency." The command struck Sophia like a physical blow because she knew exactly what removing the shawl would reveal and why she had taken such care to keep it concealed throughout the evening. The ballroom fell into the kind of absolute silence typically reserved for moments before executions or royal pronouncements. Every eye fixed upon Sophia as she stood frozen by Prince Alexander's command, her violet eyes reflecting the terror of someone who realized that her carefully constructed disguise was about to be stripped away before the most dangerous possible audience. The woolen shawl that had seemed like simple protection against the evening chill now felt like armor that was about to be forcibly removed, exposing vulnerabilities she had spent 2 years learning to conceal. Beneath the modest grey fabric lay evidence that would shatter every assumption the assembled aristocrats had made about her identity and circumstances. "Come now," Prince Alexander continued with the patience of a cat toying with a wounded mouse. "Surely such a simple request poses no difficulty for someone engaged in legitimate diplomatic business, unless, of course, there are reasons why you prefer to remain obscured." The cruel anticipation in his voice sent ripples of excitement through the watching crowd. They had all heard stories of the prince's talent for exposing social climbers and pretenders, his ability to strip away pretense with surgical precision until nothing remained but humiliation and ruin. Countess von Hausen leaned forward with undisguised eagerness. "Yes, do show us, my dear. After all, if you're truly here on diplomatic business as you claim, there should be no shame in revealing your proper credentials." "Indeed," added Baron von Kraus with malicious pleasure. "We're all quite curious to see what sort of diplomat operates with such mysterious discretion." Sophia's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of her shawl, knowing that the moment she removed it, her life would change irrevocably. The scars that marked her shoulders and upper arms told a story that no one in this room was prepared to hear. Evidence of torture endured in Austrian dungeons, marks left by interrogators seeking information about her father's political activities. 2 years earlier, Sophia had been Lady Sophia Ravenscroft, daughter of one of England's most respected diplomats and a fixture in London's highest social circles. Her father, Lord Edmund Ravenscroft, had been conducting sensitive negotiations regarding the balance of power in Central Europe when political winds shifted and he was accused of espionage by the Austrian government. The charges had been false, manufactured by rival factions seeking to eliminate his influence on the territorial settlements following Napoleon's defeat. But false accusations backed by sufficient political pressure had the same practical effect as truth, resulting in Lord Ravenscroft's arrest, Sophia's kidnapping by Austrian agents, and a month of interrogation designed to force her father's confession to crimes he had never committed. Her father had died in prison rather than admit to treason, taking with him the evidence that would have proven both their innocence and identified the real conspirators. Sophia had survived her captivity through pure chance, when a change in government brought new officials who recognized the political liability of holding an English lord's daughter without substantial proof of wrongdoing. But her release had come too late to restore her previous life. The scandal surrounding her family's disgrace had closed every door in London society, while the physical evidence of her ordeal made it impossible to hide what she had endured. She had fled England under an assumed name, seeking anonymity in Europe, where her previous identity was unknown. "Your Highness," she said desperately, making one final attempt to escape the trap closing around her, "I must protest that such public examination is hardly appropriate for diplomatic communications of a sensitive nature." "Sensitive nature?" Prince Alexander's eyes glittered with predatory delight. "How intriguing. Perhaps you're suggesting that you carry state secrets of such importance that ordinary protocols of verification might be suspended." The suggestion carried just enough mockery to make clear his disbelief, while offering her the rope to hang herself with increasingly elaborate claims. Either she would retreat and admit the falseness of her diplomatic status, or she would advance further into lies that could be exposed with devastating effect. The watching crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were approaching the climax of an entertainment that would surpass any theatrical performance they might witness elsewhere. The destruction of a presumptuous impostor by their brilliant prince would provide conversation material for months of future gatherings. "I think," announced Lady Pemberton with the authority of someone whose social position granted her the right to make such pronouncements, "that His Highness has been remarkably patient with someone whose credentials appear increasingly suspect. Surely it's time for complete transparency?" "Absolutely," agreed the Marchese di Montecroce, clearly eager to demonstrate his loyalty to his host by supporting the exposure of a potential deceiver. Diplomatic immunity cannot extend to protecting actual criminals from proper identification. The word criminal sent a chill through Sophia's entire body because it struck closer to the truth than any of them realized. In the eyes of Austrian authorities, she remained a fugitive from justice, someone who had escaped before completing her interrogation about her father's supposed espionage activities. If her true identity were revealed here tonight, among a gathering that included Austrian diplomatic representatives, her arrest and extradition would be virtually guaranteed. The diplomatic immunity she had claimed as protection would evaporate the moment her false status was exposed, leaving her vulnerable to the very forces she had spent 2 years evading. "Your Highness," Baron von Richter interjected with the careful neutrality of an experienced diplomat, "perhaps this matter might be handled with somewhat more discretion. If there are legitimate diplomatic issues involved." "Discretion." Prince Alexander's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "My dear Baron, discretion is precisely what allows impostors and criminals to operate with impunity. Sometimes public exposure serves justice better than private investigation." The philosophical justification for his cruelty was perfectly calibrated to appeal to his audience's sense of righteousness, while providing entertainment value that private confrontation could never achieve. Sophia realized with growing desperation that escape had become impossible. The crowd had formed a semicircle around her, blocking any retreat toward the servants' entrance, while Prince Alexander's position cut off access to the main doors. She was trapped in the center of a human amphitheater, with no choice but to face whatever exposure awaited. "Perhaps," the prince continued with theatrical magnanimity, "we might approach this matter systematically. First, the removal of your shawl, so that we might see exactly whom we're addressing. Then examination of these mysterious diplomatic documents you claim to carry. Finally, verification of your credentials through our various diplomatic representatives present tonight." The step-by-step process he outlined was designed to maximize both suspense and humiliation, ensuring that her destruction would be gradual and thorough rather than swift and merciful. "After all," he added with false solicitude, "if you're truly here on legitimate business, each step should only serve to vindicate your claims and enhance your credibility. You have nothing to fear from transparency if your purposes are honest." The logical trap was perfect. Resistance would be interpreted as evidence of guilt, while compliance would lead to exposure that would destroy her regardless of her innocence or legitimacy. Count Ferenc Esterhazy, one of the Austrian representatives Prince Alexander had mentioned, stepped forward with obvious interest. "Your Highness, if this young woman is indeed connected to diplomatic matters, the Austrian Empire would certainly appreciate the opportunity to verify her credentials. We maintain careful records of all authorized diplomatic personnel." The offer sent ice through Sophia's veins, because Count Esterhazy's careful records would immediately identify her as Lady Sophia Ravencroft, wanted fugitive from Austrian justice. Her photograph and description had been circulated to all diplomatic posts with instructions for immediate arrest and extradition. "How generous of you, Count," Prince Alexander replied with satisfaction. "I'm certain that Austrian thoroughness will help us resolve any questions about our mysterious guest's true identity." Sophia's mind raced through increasingly desperate options as she realized that she had perhaps minutes before her careful anonymity was destroyed forever. The diplomatic documents in her reticule seemed to mock her with their legitimate importance, real business that had brought her into this trap where truth and falsehood had become equally dangerous. "Your Highness," she said with the dignity of someone who had survived far worse ordeals than social humiliation, "if you are determined to proceed with this examination, might I request that we at least conduct it in a manner appropriate to the diplomatic sensitivities involved." "Diplomatic sensitivities?" The prince's smile was sharp as a blade. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about propriety. Very well, we shall proceed with all the ceremony appropriate to your claimed status." He gestured grandly to the watching crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness the exposure of someone who has dared to infiltrate our gathering under false pretenses. Let this serve as an education in the consequences of presuming beyond one's proper station." With theatrical flourish, Prince Alexander reached toward Sophia's shawl, preparing to remove it himself if she would not comply voluntarily. But as his fingers touched the woolen fabric, neither he nor anyone else in the ballroom realized that in a secured office 3 floors above them, an elderly man with tired eyes was signing documents that would transform the prince's moment of triumph into the first step toward his own destruction. The trap that seemed to be closing around Sophia was actually closing around them all, guided by forces that none of the evening's players understood or anticipated. Prince Alexander's fingers had barely grasped the edge of Sophia's shawl when the ballroom doors burst open, with the thunderous crash of wood striking marble. The sound cut through the tense silence like cannon fire, causing every head to turn toward the source of the interruption, with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity at whatever drama was unfolding. A figure in the dark uniform of the Royal Courier Service strode into the ballroom with the urgent purpose of someone bearing news that could not wait for convenient timing. Behind him followed two men in the somber black attire of legal officials, their serious expressions suggesting that whatever business brought them here transcended the evening's social festivities. "Your Royal Highness," the courier announced with formal precision that carried clearly across the now silent ballroom, "I bear urgent communications from His Majesty the King, requiring your immediate and personal attention." Prince Alexander's hand froze on Sophia's shawl as he realized that his moment of theatrical triumph was being interrupted by something that superseded even his royal prerogatives. The courier's invocation of the king's authority meant that whatever documents he carried took precedence over any other business, no matter how personally satisfying. "Can this matter not wait until morning?" the prince asked with barely controlled irritation. "I am presently engaged in addressing a security concern that requires immediate resolution. I regret, Your Highness, that His Majesty's instructions were explicit regarding the urgency of this communication. Furthermore," the courier continued with diplomatic precision, "the legal representatives present are authorized to witness and implement certain provisions that take effect immediately upon delivery." The mention of immediate implementation sent a ripple of unease through the assembled aristocrats. Legal documents that required immediate effect were typically associated with matters of succession, criminal charges, or other circumstances that could dramatically alter existing power structures. Sophia felt Prince Alexander's grip on her shawl loosen as his attention shifted to this new development. The interruption provided a momentary reprieve from her exposure, though she remained trapped in the center of the crowd with no clear path to escape whatever revelations were about to unfold. "Very well," Prince Alexander said, with the grace of someone accustomed to managing unexpected developments without losing dignity. "Present His Majesty's communications, though I trust this matter truly merits such dramatic interruption of our evening's festivities." The courier stepped forward, withdrawing from his dispatch case a series of documents bearing the elaborate seals that marked communications of the highest importance. "Your Highness, I am instructed to inform you that new evidence has come to light regarding the Ravenscroft affair of 2 years past." Sophia's blood turned to ice in her veins as she heard her family name spoken aloud in this gathering for the first time since her exile began. The investigation she had believed closed forever was apparently being reopened, with implications that could extend far beyond her personal circumstances. "The Ravenscroft affair," Prince Alexander repeated with interest that contained no recognition of its personal relevance to anyone present. "The English diplomat who was convicted of espionage by our Austrian allies? I recall the case caused considerable diplomatic tensions at the time." "Indeed, Your Highness. However, Austrian authorities have recently uncovered evidence proving that Lord Edmund Ravenscroft was entirely innocent of all charges brought against him. Furthermore, they have identified the actual perpetrators of the espionage activities for which he was falsely accused." The revelation struck the ballroom like a physical blow, causing several Austrian representatives to exchange glances of obvious discomfort. Count Esterhazy's face had gone ashen as he realized that his government's certainty about the Ravenscroft case was being publicly challenged before a gathering of European diplomats. "According to these documents," the courier continued with relentless precision, "the true conspirators included several high-ranking Austrian officials who used Lord Ravenscroft as a convenient scapegoat to cover their own treasonous activities. The evidence includes confessions, financial records, and correspondence that proves the systematic frame of an innocent man." Sophia struggled to process the implications of what she was hearing. Her father's innocence was being vindicated publicly before the very people whose prejudice and political calculation had destroyed her family. But the timing of this revelation in this place seemed too convenient to be mere coincidence. Furthermore, the courier announced, consulting a second document, "His Majesty wishes to express his particular concern for the fate of Lord Ravenscroft's daughter, Lady Sophia Ravenscroft, who disappeared during the investigation and whose whereabouts remain unknown. A substantial reward has been posted for information leading to her safe location and return to English protection." Prince Alexander's hand dropped away from Sophia's shawl entirely as the legal and political implications of the courier's announcement began to penetrate his consciousness. If the Ravencroft accusations had been false, and if Austria had been concealing evidence of their own officials' guilt, the diplomatic ramifications would be enormous. The legal representatives present, the courier continued, are authorized to take immediate custody of any Austrian officials found to have participated in the conspiracy, pending formal extradition proceedings. Count Esterhazy, you are specifically named in the confessions as having personally overseen the interrogation of Lady Sophia Ravencroft. Count Esterhazy's face cycled through shock, denial and dawning terror as he realized that his careful concealment of his role in the conspiracy had been shattered by the very confessions he had assumed would never surface. "This is preposterous," he stammered desperately. "I had minimal involvement in the Ravencroft matter, and my actions were entirely consistent with Austrian legal procedures." "Your actions," interrupted the lead legal representative with cold authority, "included the torture of an innocent young woman to force false confessions that would support charges against her father. The medical records documenting her injuries have been recovered and verified." Sophia's knees nearly buckled as she realized that the evidence of her ordeal, the scars hidden beneath her shawl, the nightmares that still haunted her sleep, the psychological wounds that had never fully healed, had become the foundation for prosecuting those who had inflicted such suffering. "Moreover," the legal representative continued, "any persons found to have knowingly harbored or assisted these fugitives from justice may themselves face charges as accessories to the original conspiracy." The threat sent a chill through every Austrian representative present as they began to calculate their own exposure to prosecution based on their knowledge of or participation in the cover-up that had followed the Ravencroft investigation. Prince Alexander, whose attention had been entirely focused on the dramatic revelations about Austrian guilt, suddenly remembered the young woman whose exposure he had been orchestrating when this interruption occurred. He turned back toward Sophia with curiosity rather than hostility, his predatory interest replaced by something approaching professional concern. "How extraordinary that such revelations should surface at this particular moment," he mused aloud, his gaze fixing upon Sophia with new intensity. "One might almost think that Providence had arranged for justice to emerge precisely when it was most needed." Sophia felt the weight of his attention like a physical pressure, but now it carried speculation rather than cruelty. She could see him analyzing the timing, the circumstances, the remarkable coincidence of the Ravencroft vindication occurring just as he was about to expose someone whose mysterious presence had aroused his suspicions. "Tell me," Prince Alexander said with dangerous quiet, "your mysterious diplomatic business tonight, might it have some connection to these remarkable revelations? After all, the timing does seem rather coordinated." The observation was delivered with the precision of someone whose intelligence had finally begun working in the right direction, connecting dots that revealed patterns he had been too focused on immediate entertainment to notice earlier. Sophia realized with growing terror that the prince was beginning to suspect her true identity, not through the exposure of her scars, but through the careful analysis of circumstances that had brought her here tonight. His legal training and political acumen were finally engaging with the puzzle she represented. "Your Highness," she said carefully, "I am merely a secretary carrying routine diplomatic correspondence. I have no personal connection to these extraordinary revelations about the Ravencroft matter." But even as she spoke, Sophia could see in Prince Alexander's eyes that her denial was having the opposite effect from what she intended. Her obvious distress at the mention of the Ravencroft case, combined with her presence here tonight and her mysterious reluctance to reveal her credentials, was forming a picture that grew clearer with each passing moment. "A secretary," he repeated thoughtfully. "How interesting. And yet you carry yourself with the bearing of someone accustomed to much higher station. Your speech patterns suggest extensive education in languages and diplomatic protocol. Your knowledge of court etiquette appears remarkably comprehensive for someone employed in clerical capacities." Each observation fell like a hammer blow as Prince Alexander systematically deconstructed the careful disguise that had protected her for 2 years. His analytical mind, once focused on her destruction, was now working toward her identification with the same relentless precision. "Most intriguingly," he continued with growing certainty, "you appear remarkably well informed about the sensitivities surrounding Austrian diplomatic relations for someone allegedly engaged in routine correspondence delivery. The trap that had seemed to threaten her exposure for social climbing was transforming into something far more dangerous: identification as the very person whose vindication was unfolding before their eyes, but whose location among potential Austrian agents made her vulnerable to immediate arrest before English protection could be established. Sophia realized with growing desperation that the vindication she had dreamed of for 2 years was about to become the mechanism of her final destruction. The silence that followed Prince Alexander's observations stretched through the ballroom like a wire drawn to breaking point. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath as they sensed the approach of a revelation that would transform their understanding of the evening's events from social entertainment to international crisis. Count Esterhazy, realizing that his own arrest was imminent, made a desperate calculation that if he could identify and seize Lady Sophia Ravenscroft before English authorities established her protection, she might serve as a bargaining chip in negotiations for his own freedom. "Your Highness," he said with the smooth urgency of a gambler playing his final card, "if that young woman is indeed connected to the Ravenscroft matter, Austrian law requires that she be taken into custody for completion of the investigation that was interrupted by her escape 2 years ago." The claim sent shockwaves through the assembled diplomats, who immediately understood that Count Esterhazy was attempting to arrest someone under English protection on foreign soil, an act that would constitute a diplomatic crisis of the first magnitude. "Count Esterhazy," Prince Alexander's voice carried the dangerous quiet of absolute authority, challenged by desperate presumption. "You appear to be suggesting that you would conduct arrests within my ballroom during my celebration without my consent or cooperation. Have I understood your position correctly?" The prince's legal training had immediately grasped the implications of what the count was proposing: a violation of diplomatic immunity, territorial sovereignty, and royal authority that would justify the most severe response. "Your Highness," Count Esterhazy replied desperately, "if that woman is Lady Sophia Ravenscroft, she is a fugitive from Austrian justice, whose apprehension takes precedence over normal diplomatic protocols." "Does it?" Prince Alexander's smile was sharp as winter steel. "How fascinating. Please enlighten me about these superior authorities that supersede royal sovereignty within my own palace." The philosophical trap was perfectly constructed. By claiming authority over the prince's territory, Count Esterhazy was challenging the very foundations of royal power in ways that no monarch could tolerate without undermining their own legitimacy. Sophia watched this byplay with growing amazement as she realized that Prince Alexander's wounded pride at being challenged was providing protection she had never expected. His anger at Count Esterhazy's presumption was creating space for her to consider options beyond immediate arrest or continued concealment. The legal representative who had delivered the king's documents stepped forward with careful authority. "Count Esterhazy, any attempts to arrest or detain Lady Sophia Ravenscroft, should she be present, would constitute interference with a person under explicit English royal protection. Such interference would be considered an act of aggression against the English crown. Furthermore," his colleague added with diplomatic precision, "the new evidence has established that Lady Sophia was herself a victim of Austrian crimes rather than a perpetrator. Any person who participated in her original persecution now faces prosecution for those crimes, making them hardly suitable authorities for her arrest." Count Esterhazy's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized that his attempt to seize Sophia as a bargaining chip was being systematically demolished by superior legal authority. His own participation in her torture had been exposed, making him a wanted criminal rather than a law enforcement official. "This is intolerable," he declared with aristocratic fury. "You cannot seriously suggest that a fugitive who has been living under false identity should be granted immunity from prosecution simply because new evidence has emerged regarding other aspects of the case." Prince Alexander's eyes glittered with dangerous amusement as he recognized the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority while protecting royal prerogatives from foreign challenge. "Actually, Count, that is precisely what I am suggesting," he said with silky menace. "Within my territory, English law regarding protection of their citizens takes precedence over Austrian claims, particularly when those claims are advanced by persons now revealed as criminals themselves." He turned toward Sophia with an expression that combined curiosity, respect, and something approaching apology for his earlier attempted humiliation of someone whose identity he was beginning to understand. "Lady Sophia Ravenscroft," he said formally, using her title for the first time and causing several gasps from the assembled crowd. "If that is indeed who you are, you have my personal assurance of protection and my profound regrets for any distress my earlier entertainment may have caused." Sophia felt tears begin to flow as she heard her true name spoken with respect rather than accusation for the first time in 2 years. The identity she had hidden so carefully was being acknowledged not as a source of shame, but as a vindication of her father's honor and her own survival. "Your Highness," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I am indeed Lady Sophia Ravencroft, daughter of the late Lord Edmund Ravencroft, and I thank you for your protection during this remarkable evening." The admission sent electric excitement through the ballroom as the assembled aristocrats realized they had been witnessing the exposure not of an impostor, but of a legitimate member of the nobility whose dramatic survival story was unfolding before their eyes. Moreover, Prince Alexander continued with growing satisfaction at the dramatic reversal he was orchestrating, "I find myself curious about the diplomatic documents you mentioned carrying. If they are connected to the evidence that has vindicated your father, their contents might prove most illuminating." Sophia withdrew from her reticule the sealed papers that had brought her to this gathering, realizing that their contents might indeed be connected to the broader investigation that had exposed the Austrian conspiracy. "These documents," she explained, "contain trade negotiations that my employer, Lady Pembroke, believed required urgent attention from Baron von Richter regarding Prussian-English commercial agreements." Prince Alexander examined the seals and official markings with the expertise of someone trained in diplomatic protocol. "Lady Pembroke," he mused thoughtfully, "would be the same Lady Pembroke who serves as an unofficial intelligence coordinator for English interests in Central Europe." The observation revealed layers of complexity that Sophia herself had not fully understood. Her employment with Lady Pembroke had seemed like simple secretarial work, but apparently had involved her in intelligence operations whose significance extended far beyond routine correspondence. "Your Highness," Baron von Richter interjected with obvious concern, "if Lady Sophia has been serving as Lady Pembroke's representative, and if these documents are connected to the investigation that exposed the Austrian conspiracy, their security becomes a matter of international importance." The Baron's statement highlighted the extraordinary position Sophia now occupied, no longer a fugitive hiding from false accusations, but a key figure in intelligence operations whose exposure of Austrian crimes had apparently facilitated their detection by English authorities. Count Esterhazy, realizing that his position was becoming increasingly desperate, made one final attempt to seize control of the situation through direct action rather than legal argument. "Enough of this pretense," he declared, lunging towards Sophia with clear intent to physically apprehend her, despite the diplomatic consequences. "If you will not arrest this woman, I will take her myself." But his desperate move was intercepted by Prince Alexander himself, who stepped between Count Esterhazy and Sophia with the fluid grace of someone whose military training extended far beyond ceremonial sword work. "Count Esterhazy," the prince said with deadly quiet, his hand resting meaningfully on his sword hilt, "I believe I mentioned that attempts to arrest anyone within my ballroom would require my consent and cooperation. Since you appear to have difficulty understanding diplomatic protocol, perhaps a more direct form of education would prove beneficial." The challenge was unmistakable. Count Esterhazy could retreat and accept arrest by English authorities, or he could face Prince Alexander in combat that would almost certainly result in his death, even if he emerged victorious. Furthermore, the prince continued with growing authority, "I find myself personally offended by your assumption that my protection is insufficiently robust to safeguard someone under my explicit guarantee of safety." The personal insult transformed the confrontation from diplomatic incident to matter of royal honor, ensuring that any violence would be remembered as Count Esterhazy's attack on sovereign authority rather than mere protection of a fugitive. Sophia watched in amazement as the prince, who had been preparing to humiliate her publicly, was now risking personal combat to protect her from arrest by the very people who had tortured her 2 years earlier. The evolution from persecutor to protector seemed impossible, yet was unfolding before her eyes through the simple mechanism of wounded royal pride and outraged territorial authority combining to create unexpected sanctuary. But as Count Esterhazy's hand moved toward his own weapon, Sophia realized that the ballroom was about to become a battlefield where her vindication might be written in blood rather than legal documents. The tension in the ballroom reached breaking point as Count Esterhazy's hand touched his sword hilt, his desperate calculation that combat offered better prospects than capture by English authorities written clearly across his features. The assembled aristocrats pressed back against the walls, forming a human amphitheater around what was about to become a duel that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for decades. But before steel could clear leather, the ballroom doors opened once more to admit a figure whose mere presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. King Frederick himself entered with the quiet authority of absolute power, his aged features reflecting both weariness and determination as he surveyed the extraordinary scene before him. "Gentlemen," the king said with deceptive mildness, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "I find myself curious about the dramatic entertainment that has apparently replaced the musical performances I commissioned for this evening's celebration." Prince Alexander immediately stepped back from his confrontational stance with Count Esterhazy, his filial training overriding even royal pride when faced with his father's unexpected presence. "Your Majesty, I was protecting a guest from unlawful arrest by foreign agents operating without proper authority." "How commendable," King Frederick replied with subtle approval, "though I confess surprise that such protection required resort to armed confrontation within our own palace. Surely our legal protections should suffice for such purposes." The gentle rebuke carried sufficient authority to deflate Count Esterhazy's desperate aggression while acknowledging Prince Alexander's proper instincts regarding territorial sovereignty and guest protection. "Count Esterhazy," the king continued, turning his attention to the Austrian representative whose involvement in torture and conspiracy had been exposed by the evening's revelations, "I understand you have been having difficulty accepting the jurisdiction of our courts over events occurring within our territory." "Your Majesty," Count Esterhazy said desperately, "I was merely attempting to apprehend a fugitive whose presence here threatens the security of legitimate diplomatic proceedings." "Were you?" King Frederick's voice carried the deceptive quiet of someone whose patience had been exhausted by presumption and desperation. "How interesting. Perhaps you would be good enough to explain your authority for conducting arrests within my palace without my knowledge or consent." The question was delivered with the precision of a legal trap designed to force Count Esterhazy into admitting either his complete lack of authority or his deliberate violation of diplomatic protocol and royal sovereignty. "Furthermore," the king continued without waiting for an answer, "I find myself particularly curious about your qualifications for determining the security threats posed by Lady Sophia Ravencroft, given that you are now revealed as one of the principal perpetrators of the crimes committed against her family." Sophia felt her knees weaken with relief as she heard the king acknowledge both her identity and her innocence with the authority that made such acknowledgement politically definitive. Royal recognition meant that her exile was officially ended, her father's honor restored, and her own safety guaranteed by the highest possible power. "Lady Sophia," King Frederick said gently, turning toward her with the courtesy due to someone whose suffering had been both unjust and politically inconvenient, "please accept our profound regrets for the ordeals you have endured and our assurance that those responsible will face appropriate justice." "Your Majesty is most gracious," Sophia replied, struggling to maintain composure as 2 years of fear, uncertainty, and careful concealment finally gave way to official vindication and protection. "Not gracious," the king corrected with firm conviction, "merely just. Your father was innocent of all charges. You were tortured for information about crimes that were never committed, and those responsible have evaded consequences for their actions far too long." He turned back toward Count Esterhazy with the expression of someone preparing to render final judgment. "Count, you will surrender yourself immediately to English custody for transportation to London, where you will stand trial for conspiracy, torture, and murder. Any resistance will be considered an act of war against our realm. Your Majesty?" Count Esterhazy made one final desperate appeal. "Surely diplomatic immunity—" "Diplomatic immunity," Prince Alexander interrupted with cold satisfaction, "does not extend to protecting war criminals from prosecution for crimes against persons under English protection. Your diplomatic status was revoked the moment your participation in torture was revealed." The legal principle he cited was impeccable. Diplomatic immunity served to protect legitimate governmental representatives, not to shelter criminals from consequences for acts that violated international law and human decency. Furthermore, King Frederick added with finality that brooked no appeal, any other Austrian representatives who participated in or concealed these crimes will face similar prosecution. The evidence recovered by our investigation is comprehensive and conclusive. Several other Austrian diplomats in the ballroom began edging toward the exits as they realized that their own involvement in the conspiracy might soon be exposed and prosecuted. But the king's attention had already shifted back to Sophia, whose extraordinary survival and the intelligence work she had unknowingly performed deserved acknowledgement beyond mere vindication of past suffering. "Lady Sophia," he said with growing warmth, "I understand that your work with Lady Pembroke has provided valuable intelligence regarding Austrian activities in Central Europe. Your unique knowledge of their methods and personnel makes you invaluable to our ongoing security operations." Sophia blinked in surprise as she realized that her employment as a secretary had indeed involved her in espionage work whose significance she had never fully understood. Lady Pembroke's routine correspondence had apparently been intelligence gathering that used Sophia's insider knowledge of Austrian operations. "Moreover," King Frederick continued, "your experience provides insights into Austrian interrogation techniques and conspiracy methods that could prove crucial in preventing similar operations against other English interests." The transformation of her survival from personal tragedy to national asset was so complete that Sophia struggled to process the implications. Her suffering was being transformed into expertise that could protect others from similar persecution. Prince Alexander, who had been listening to these revelations with growing amazement, stepped forward with an expression that combined respect, apology, and something deeper that had developed during the evening's extraordinary events. "Lady Sophia," he said formally, "I owe you profound apologies for my earlier behavior. I mistook strength hidden by necessity for weakness, attempting deception, and nearly committed a grave injustice through my own arrogance and blindness." The admission was delivered with genuine humility that contrasted sharply with his earlier cruel confidence in his ability to expose and humiliate social climbers. "Your Highness is most gracious," Sophia replied, though her voice carried warmth that suggested his protection during the confrontation with Count Esterhazy had earned forgiveness for his earlier intentions. "Not gracious," Prince Alexander echoed his father's earlier correction, merely attempting to learn from errors that could have had catastrophic consequences. "Your dignity under persecution, your courage in maintaining your mission despite personal danger, and your grace in the face of threatened exposure demonstrate qualities that I had failed to recognize or appreciate." King Frederick observed this exchange with subtle approval, recognizing that his son's education in humility and justice was being advanced through direct confrontation with the consequences of his own prejudices and assumptions. "Lady Sophia," the king said with decision that indicated the conclusion of the evening's official business, "you will remain under our personal protection while we complete the prosecution of those who wronged your family. Furthermore, we would be honored if you would consider accepting a position in our diplomatic service where your unique qualifications could serve England's interests while ensuring your continued safety and recognition." The offer was simultaneously practical and generous, employment that would utilize her experience while providing status and protection that made future persecution impossible. But as Sophia prepared to accept this extraordinary offer of vindication and advancement, she found her attention drawn not to the king's generous proposition, but to Prince Alexander's expression of genuine respect and growing attraction. The man who had been preparing to humiliate her for his guests' entertainment was now looking at her with the kind of interest that suggested their relationship might evolve far beyond formal apologies and official protection. The evening that had begun with the threat of exposure and arrest was concluding with vindication, royal protection, and the possibility of something that neither had expected when the confrontation began. 6 months after the night that had transformed public humiliation into royal vindication, Sophia stood in the rose garden of Valdris Palace, reviewing intelligence reports that would have been unimaginable to the frightened woman who had once hidden her identity behind a borrowed shawl. The morning sun caught the sapphire engagement ring on her finger, a symbol not just of personal happiness, but of the extraordinary journey from fugitive to princess that her courage and survival had made possible. The trials of the Austrian conspirators had concluded 3 weeks earlier, with convictions that sent shockwaves through European diplomatic circles. Count Esterhazy and his accomplices now faced life imprisonment for their crimes, while the revelation of their systematic frame of innocent diplomats had prompted comprehensive reforms in international law regarding the treatment of political prisoners. "Your Ladyship," approached Captain Morrison, the head of the intelligence service that Sophia now helped to coordinate. "The final reports from our Vienna operations have arrived. The network that destroyed your father has been completely dismantled, and we've identified 17 other cases where similar tactics were used against innocent targets." Sophia accepted the documents with the professional competence that had developed through months of transforming her personal experience of persecution into systematic protection for others. Her unique insights into Austrian interrogation methods had proven invaluable in detecting and preventing similar operations against English interests. "Excellent work, Captain," she replied, scanning the summary that detailed how her survival and eventual testimony had catalyzed the exposure of an entire conspiracy network. "Have arrangements been made for the compensation of other families who were targeted by these operations?" "His Majesty has approved your recommendations in full," Captain Morrison confirmed. "The Ravencroft Foundation will provide support for all families affected by these false accusations, using the assets seized from the conspirators to fund rehabilitation and vindication efforts." The foundation that bore her family name had become Sophia's primary focus beyond her intelligence work, ensuring that others who faced similar persecution would have resources and support that had been denied to her during her years of exile and concealment. Prince Alexander approached through the garden paths with the easy confidence of someone whose character had been fundamentally transformed through confronting the consequences of his own prejudices and assumptions. The man who had once delighted in exposing and humiliating social climbers had become one of Europe's most respected advocates for justice and protection of the vulnerable. "My dear," he said with the warmth that had replaced his former cruel amusement, "I bring remarkable news from Parliament. The International Protocol on Diplomatic Protection has been unanimously approved, with specific provisions that will prevent anyone from facing the ordeal you endured." The legislation they had worked together to draft would establish legal protections, ensuring that diplomatic families could not be targeted for persecution based on false accusations, and that any person claiming such protection would receive immediate investigation rather than summary arrest. Furthermore, Prince Alexander continued, his smile reflecting both personal satisfaction and recognition of broader significance, "The French have formally adopted our prisoner treatment standards, while the Austrians have agreed to complete restructuring of their intelligence services under international oversight." Sophia felt deep satisfaction at hearing how her personal suffering had been transformed into systemic changes that would protect countless others from similar persecution. The torture she had endured had become the foundation for reforms that made such treatment illegal under international law. "There is additional news," Prince Alexander said, his expression growing more personal as he withdrew an official document bearing royal seals, "from my father regarding our wedding arrangements." King Frederick had not merely approved their engagement, but had insisted that their wedding serve as a celebration of the principles they had come to represent: the triumph of justice over persecution, mercy over vengeance, and love over the prejudices that had nearly kept them apart. "His Majesty wishes to invite the diplomatic corps from across Europe," Alexander explained, "so that our marriage can symbolize the new era of international cooperation and human dignity that your courage has helped to establish." The wedding would indeed be more than a personal celebration. It would serve as a diplomatic statement that the old systems of persecution and conspiracy had been replaced by new standards of justice and accountability. "My love," Sophia said, using the intimacy that had grown between them through months of working together to transform tragedy into triumph, "do you ever regret the path that led us to this moment? The confrontation that could have destroyed both our reputations?" Prince Alexander's smile was immediate and wholehearted. "I regret only my blindness that nearly prevented me from recognizing the extraordinary woman who survived such ordeals with her character, not just intact, but strengthened by adversity." "And you?" he asked in return. "Do you regret the choice to maintain your mission that night, despite the personal danger it represented?" Sophia considered the question seriously, thinking of the terrified young woman who had stood in that ballroom, believing her carefully constructed anonymity was about to be stripped away by cruel aristocrats seeking entertainment. "I regret only the years of hiding that were necessary for survival," she replied with quiet conviction. "Everything that followed, including your initial attempt to humiliate me, was necessary for both of us to become the people capable of building what we've created together." Their relationship had indeed become far more than romantic partnership. It had evolved into a collaboration that influenced policy across multiple nations and provided protection for vulnerable populations who had previously lacked any recourse against persecution. Through the garden windows, they could see young Victoria Ashworth working at her lessons with Professor Hartwell, the former secretary, whose own survival of political persecution had led to her appointment as chief educator for the diplomatic academy they had established. The academy trained young diplomats in principles of human dignity and justice that would prevent future generations from implementing the kind of systematic persecution that had destroyed so many innocent families. "Our daughter will never know a world where birth circumstances or political accusations can strip someone of basic human protections," Alexander observed with satisfaction. "The legacy we're building ensures that the kind of suffering you endured becomes impossible for future victims." More importantly, Sophia added, she will grow up understanding that privilege carries obligations to protect those who lack such advantages, rather than opportunities to exploit or humiliate them. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing invitations to the evening's celebration, a gathering that would bring together former victims of political persecution alongside the diplomats who now worked to prevent such treatment under the new international protocols. "Lady Sophia," the messenger announced formally, "His Majesty requests your presence at tonight's ceremony, recognizing the victims whose courage in coming forward made possible the prosecution of those responsible for systematic violations of human dignity." The ceremony would honor not just Sophia's survival, but the dozens of other individuals whose willingness to testify had exposed the full scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many innocent lives. As evening approached, and they prepared for the gathering that would celebrate transformation of personal suffering into collective protection, Sophia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from that terrifying night in the ballroom to this moment of recognition and influence. The shawl that she had fought so desperately to keep in place had been hiding not shame, but evidence of injustice that, when finally revealed, had catalyzed reforms extending across continents. Her attempted exposure as an impostor had instead led to her recognition as someone whose survival and courage had made possible protections for thousands of others. Most remarkably, the prince, who had been preparing to strip away her disguise for his guests' cruel entertainment, had become the man whose love and partnership gave meaning to the work they had built from the ashes of her persecution. "Do you remember," Alexander asked as they walked toward the palace where their guests awaited, "what you told me that first night about the diplomatic documents you carried? That they contained routine correspondence requiring urgent attention," Sophia replied with a smile at the memory of her desperate attempt to maintain her cover story. "They did indeed contain information requiring urgent attention," Alexander observed with warm amusement, "though neither of us understood at the time that they would lead to the exposure of an international conspiracy and the establishment of protections that will outlive us both." And Sophia added, her voice warm with the deep contentment of someone who had found purpose in transformation of suffering into service, to the discovery that two people who began as persecutor and victim could become partners in ensuring that such persecution becomes impossible for others. As they entered the ballroom where their story had begun with such different intentions, Sophia felt the deep satisfaction of someone whose survival had been transformed into salvation for countless others. The woman who had been ordered to remove her shawl as proof of her imposture had instead revealed evidence that destroyed those who had tortured innocent victims for political convenience. The prince who had commanded that exposure had become a champion of the dignity he had once threatened to violate. Together, they had proven that individual courage in moments of crisis could indeed reshape the world, that love could grow from the ashes of persecution, and that the greatest triumph was not personal happiness, but the knowledge that their suffering and growth had created protections that would shield others from similar ordeals. In the ballroom where it all began, surrounded by the evidence of changes that would extend across generations, the former fugitive and the reformed prince continued their quiet revolution. One law, one life, one act of protection at a time. 20 years after the night that had transformed a cruel prince's entertainment into the catalyst for international reform, Princess Sophia Valdris stood before the newly consecrated Cathedral of Human Dignity, where representatives from every major European power had gathered to commemorate the signing of the Universal Covenant on the Protection of the Innocent, legislation that had grown directly from her survival and testimony. The cathedral itself had been built with stones quarried from the ruins of the Austrian prison where her father had died, transformed through royal decree into a monument ensuring that the suffering of the innocent would be remembered and never repeated. The stained glass windows told stories not of saints and martyrs, but of ordinary people whose courage in the face of persecution had advanced the cause of human dignity. "Your Royal Highness," approached Ambassador Laurent Dubois, the French representative whose own family had benefited from the protections established through Sophia's advocacy. "The final signatures have been obtained. Every major power in Europe has now committed to the enforcement protocols that make political persecution legally impossible under international law." Sophia accepted the historic document with hands that had long since healed from the physical scars of her ordeal, though they remained marked by the delicate tracery of lines that testified to survival against overwhelming odds. At 44, she had become one of Europe's most respected voices on matters of justice and human protection, her influence extending far beyond the diplomatic sphere into education, law, and international policy. "Ambassador Dubois," she replied with the quiet authority that had replaced her former fearful discretion, "please convey to your government our gratitude for their leadership in ensuring that these protections extend beyond European borders to our colonial territories as well. The expansion of human dignity protections, to include indigenous populations and colonial subjects, had represented the logical extension of principles that had begun with her personal vindication, but had grown to encompass universal recognition of inherent human worth, regardless of political circumstances." Prince Alexander, now King Alexander following his father's peaceful death 3 years earlier, approached with their son Prince Edmund, named in honor of Sophia's father, whose false conviction had catalyzed the reforms they had spent 2 decades implementing. At 17, Edmund had grown into a young man whose character reflected the principles his parents had fought to establish. Unlike previous generations of royal offspring, who had been raised to expect deference and privilege without corresponding obligations, he had been educated to understand that power served justice rather than personal convenience. "Mother," Edmund said with the easy affection characteristic of children raised in environments where love and respect formed the foundation of all relationships, "the delegation from the American territories has arrived with the ratification documents. They particularly wish to thank you for the prisoner treatment protocols that prevented the persecution of their independence advocates." Sophia smiled at the reminder that their work had influenced political developments far beyond European borders. The principles they had established for protecting political prisoners had been adopted by emerging democracies as safeguards against the kind of systematic persecution that had characterized older governmental systems. Furthermore, Prince Edmund continued with obvious pride in his parents' achievements, "Professor Morrison wishes to present the final report on the global impact of the Ravencroft Foundation's work." The foundation that had begun as compensation for Sophia's family's suffering had expanded into an international organization, providing legal protection, financial support, and advocacy for victims of political persecution across multiple continents. The latest report documented over 12,000 families who had received assistance in achieving vindication and rebuilding their lives. King Alexander, whose transformation from cruel prince to champion of justice had become legendary in diplomatic circles, joined their conversation with news that would complete the evening's historical significance. "My beloved," he said with the warmth that had only deepened through 20 years of partnership in marriage and mission, "I bring word from Rome. His Holiness has agreed to include protection of the innocent from political persecution among the fundamental moral principles binding upon all Christian nations." The papal endorsement would extend their legal protections into moral imperatives that transcended governmental authority, creating religious as well as secular foundations for human dignity that would be extremely difficult for future rulers to overturn. "There is additional news," Alexander continued, his expression reflecting both personal satisfaction and recognition of broader historical significance, "that touches upon the completion of our life's work." He gestured toward the approaching figure of Victoria Ashworth. now Director General of the International Commission on Human Dignity and one of Europe's youngest but most respected legal authorities. Your Royal Highnesses, Victoria announced with barely contained excitement, I bring the final confirmations from the German states, the Italian principalities, and the Russian delegation. The Universal Covenant now enjoys unanimous support across the civilized world. The achievement represented the culmination of 2 decades of patient diplomacy, careful legislation, and persistent advocacy that had gradually transformed individual national policies into a comprehensive international framework, protecting vulnerable populations from systematic persecution. Moreover, Victoria continued, the enforcement mechanisms have been fully established. The International Tribunal for the Protection of Human Dignity will begin operations next month, with jurisdiction over any case involving political persecution, regardless of national boundaries. Sophia felt tears begin to flow as she contemplated the extraordinary scope of what had grown from her personal survival and testimony. The terrified young woman who had hidden her identity behind a borrowed shawl had become the catalyst for legal protections that would shield countless future victims from similar ordeals. As the evening ceremony began, bringing together survivors of political persecution alongside the diplomats, lawyers, and advocates who had worked to transform individual suffering into collective protection, Sophia reflected on the remarkable journey that had led to this moment of historical achievement. The ballroom confrontation that had begun with Prince Alexander's cruel intention to humiliate someone he viewed as a social climber had evolved into a partnership that influenced the treatment of vulnerable populations across the civilized world. Her desperate attempt to conceal evidence of torture had ultimately led to the exposure and prosecution of those responsible, while establishing legal precedents that made such treatment impossible under international law. My dear, Alexander said softly as they watched their son Edmund mingling effortlessly with former victims of persecution, progressive diplomats, and reform advocates from across the globe. Do you realize that our children will grow up in a world where the kind of systematic persecution we fought to overcome has been made legally and practically impossible? More importantly, Sophia replied, they will grow up understanding that their privileges exist to serve others rather than themselves. That power carries obligations rather than merely opportunities, and that the greatest achievement is not personal advancement, but the protection of those who lack such advantages. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly woman, whose presence sent ripples of recognition through the assembled crowd. Lady Catherine Pembroke, now in her 70s but still sharp as the blade that had once made her one of England's most effective intelligence coordinators, approached with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had achieved completion. Your Royal Highness, Lady Pembroke said with obvious emotion, I wanted to thank you personally for the courage you showed that night 20 years ago. Your willingness to maintain your mission despite personal danger provided the foundation for everything we celebrate tonight. The acknowledgement from the woman whose routine correspondence had actually been intelligence work revealed another layer of the evening's historical significance. Sophia's survival and eventual testimony had exposed not just individual persecution, but systematic networks of conspiracy that had been operating across multiple governments. Lady Pembroke, Sophia replied with deep respect, your guidance during those difficult years provided the framework that transformed personal suffering into effective advocacy. Without your support and training, I could never have developed the skills necessary to advance these protections. As the evening progressed with speeches, presentations, and ceremonies, recognizing the countless individuals whose courage had contributed to the reforms they were celebrating, Sophia found herself standing in the same ballroom where their story had begun with such different intentions. The room where Prince Alexander had once commanded the removal of her shawl to expose what he believed was fraudulent social climbing now hosted gatherings that celebrated the transformation of persecution into protection, suffering into service, and cruel entertainment into compassionate advocacy. Your Royal Highness, approached a young woman whose presence immediately commanded Sophia's attention. Lady Margaret Sinclair, daughter of one of the families whose vindication had been achieved through the Foundation's work, carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone whose survival had been transformed into purpose. I wanted to thank you, Lady Margaret said with emotion that carried clearly despite her obvious attempt to maintain composure, for creating the protections that prevented my family from facing the kind of persecution yours endured. The Foundation's intervention saved us from years of exile and uncertainty. The gratitude from someone who had been spared the ordeals Sophia had endured represented the ultimate validation of their work. Not just compensation for past suffering, but prevention of future persecution. "Lady Margaret," Sophia replied warmly, "your family's courage in coming forward when false accusations were made against your father helped strengthen the legal precedents that protect others from similar persecution. Every person who refuses to be silenced by intimidation contributes to the security we all enjoy." As the ceremony concluded with the formal signing of documents that would bind future generations to respect the dignity of all persons regardless of their political circumstances, Sophia felt the deep satisfaction of someone whose survival had been transformed into salvation for countless others. The woman whose shawl had hidden evidence of torture had lived to see that evidence become the foundation for protections extending across continents. The prince who had commanded its removal for his guests' cruel entertainment had become a king whose reign was defined by compassion and justice. Together, they had proven that individual choices made in moments of crisis could indeed reshape the world, that love could grow from the ashes of persecution, and that the greatest triumph was not personal happiness, but the knowledge that their suffering and growth had created protections that would outlive them both. In the ballroom where it all began, surrounded by evidence of changes that would extend across generations, the former fugitive and the reformed prince had completed their quiet revolution, transforming a world where power could be used to persecute the innocent into one where such persecution was legally, morally, and practically impossible. The shawl that had once hidden shame now rested in a place of honor in the cathedral's museum, displayed alongside the documents that had exposed the conspiracy and the legislation that had grown from that exposure. Testament to the extraordinary power of individual courage when guided by principle and sustained by love. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.